BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Alright, hello everybody. Today is Monday. Another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? This is the first broadcast for the year 2023. Happy New Year to everyone. Hope everyone had some good celebrations, or however you chose to spend December 31st. I love New Year's Eve. I think it's actually somewhat of an underrated holiday. But I was on Facebook and somebody wrote out a question. What is one regret that you've had from 2022, the most recent year that has just passed? And there are several of them, and I don't mean to be pessimistic or downtrodden or crestfallen or anything of the sort, but to actually talk to you guys about some things involving the Zodiac Killer mystery as well as other true crime cases. I'd like to incorporate the answers to that question into this episode here. And if you want to participate in the comment section down below, please leave something. Share your ideas, share your opinions, share what you think, and maybe your comment will be featured into an episode of Black Box Online Radio. And you can always like, subscribe, share with your friends and family on social media if they're curious about true crime cases. And a great way to support all of these efforts is to go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who does so will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. So, the question is, what is one regret that you've had from 2022? I regret that I wasn't able to reach more people with the Moraga Connection series that I did on BBOR. I had the opportunity to correspond with someone named Sphere the Cube, who not only had a Zodiac theory, but he also had a new Zodiac suspect, and his name is Robert Volvins. That's the name of the suspect. And I had been corresponding with Sphere for some time about his attempt to solve the Zodiac Killer mystery, and I just wanted to share the findings. He wanted to share the findings. We wanted to be very clear that we created something called Zodiac Killer New Discovery, the Moraga Letters, available here on BBOR, that people can listen to for free, because we just wanted responses, and we wanted genuine feedback, and absolutely nobody made a dime off of that series. The episodes were not monetized, and people did listen to it. You guys in the comment section responded a lot, but I really found that I had to almost beg people who are published Zodiac writers or webmasters to give their comments and feedback. I thought they would be dying to share what they thought about that particular Zodiac suspect, as well as the theories that Sphere had organized. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69, but Sphere even included in some other crimes that took place in the mid-1970s as well as the early 70s, and going all across the western part of the country and all the way to the Dakotas, most notably the murder of Laura Jean Dugan in 1972. So I think that there were a lot of very interesting ideas, and even though I wasn't convinced of everything and I didn't see eye to eye with Fury on everything, I appreciated the way he was approaching the Zodiac Killer mystery and actually looking at what the Zodiac Killer was writing out in his letters. Because the Zodiac wasn't just a murderer, he was someone who made taunting phone calls and wrote taunting letters and created the cryptograms. And Spheri looked at certain ways in which there could be mathematical clues that would lead to the solutions to the Zodiac ciphers, as well as things like the Mount Diablo code. And again, my regret is that I wasn't able to reach more people with that series, but if you are curious about any of the things in regards to the new suspect, Robert Fulvins, you can visit any of those episodes on this channel called Zodiac Killer New Discovery, the Moraga Letters. There's also one called the Zodiac Killer Moraga Connection, and of course, Did the Zodiac Killer Murder Lord Gene Dugan, all available here on Black Box Online Radio. Now, there is quite a lot of time that has passed since I started this channel. I first began Black Box Online Radio back in 2017, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I was just kind of running my mouth on the internet, and in some ways I still am, but definitely coming at it from more of a half-cocked standpoint, for lack of a better term. And I was putting out episodes on all types of subjects. My ambition was just to put out a daily segment. I just wanted to talk about any subject under the sun or in the darkness, as long as I made a YouTube upload for the day. And I just blacked out the screen, and it was Black Box Online Radio. That was my gimmick. And one subject I decided to talk about was the Zodiac Killer, because I had read websites like ZodiacKiller.com, ZodiacKillerFacts.com, ZodiacCiphers.com, and I wanted to respond to that material. And I did an episode on Lyndon Lafferty's theory, and then I did 3 episodes on Louis Myers, a suspect whom I was curious about at the time, and then I did 2 episodes on Richard Gaikowski as a Zodiac suspect, and he was perhaps is one of the most famous Zodiac killer suspects out there, and I thought it would be an interesting exercise to look at the profile on ZodiacKiller.com for Richard Gaikowski and respond to it 5 years later. Let's see if I have the same type of observations. And I'm just going to read the page that has been put out on ZodiacKiller.com. Updated July 15th, 2020. Unfortunately, for years, a certain individual has spread misinformation about Richard Gaikowski, including the false claim that Gaikowski was overseas for the first Zodiac killer crime on December 20th of 1968, and thus couldn't be the Zodiac. Thankfully, Gaikowski's passport information has finally been obtained, and soundly puts the lie to rest. Richard Gaikowski was born in Watertown, South Dakota, on March 14th, 1936. And my first interjection is, when I did the Black Box recordings back in 2010, I processed SD as San Diego, and I've done that numerous times on BBOR because the Zodiac Killer operated in California, and just looking at SD, I thought San Diego, but no, that's Watertown, South Dakota. An interesting fact is, Geik was born on Pi Day, March 14th, 314, Pi Day. He attended nearby Webster High School, then Northern State Teachers College in Aberdeen, South Dakota. He died of cancer in San Francisco on April 30th of 2004. Gaikowski served a stint in the Army during the 1950s. It is known that Gaikowski was trained as a medic. In 1963, Gaikowski moved from South Dakota to San Francisco, California, living on Parnassus Avenue and working downtown at the Daily Commercial News, a financial newspaper. By 1964, Gaikowski was working in Martinez, California, about 45 minutes from San Francisco. His home was addressed 1250 Escobar Street, which was located less than 5 miles directly south of the Zodiac's first eventual murders. During the time, Gaikowski worked as the managing editor for the local newspaper in Martinez called the News Gazette. The News Gazette was owned by the same company that also owned the much larger Vallejo Times-Herald newspaper. That will be important because the Zodiac killer would mail his first cryptogram or cipher to 3 different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Weekly editorial meetings for both the Martinez and Vallejo newspapers were held in Vallejo at the Times-Herald building. In October of 1965, Gaikowski was intentionally arrested for refusing to sign a traffic citation following a routine stop in Contra Costa County, California. As an investigative reporter for the local newspaper, Gaikowski's goal was to write a story about the conditions within the county jail from the perspective of an inmate. And I think that turned into one of the most famous photos of Geik. In fact, it's probably the most famous photo, his mugshot. And normally when it's shared, the editing has been done in a way where you only really see the outline of his facial features. You do not see absolutely every detail of his face. It's a very blurry black and white image, but some people insist that it matches the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch perfectly, and other people, like me, noticed a few peculiarities, particularly that Geik seems to have a more full face as opposed to the pointed chin of the Zodiac Killer. Following his brief stay in jail, Gaikowski's mugshot was published along with his story. However, by the time Gaikowski became a Zodiac suspect more than 20 years later, records of his fingerprints were long gone, making a comparison to Zodiac's fingerprints impossible without either Gaikowski's consent or a court order. There was no evidence what happened. Eventual Zodiac victim Darlene Ferrin of Vallejo, California got married on January 1st of 1966 and moved to Albany, New York. Gaikowski quickly followed, moving across the country. In 1969, 1970, and 1971, Gaikowski was a member of an anti-police, pro-violence counterculture newspaper and commune in San Francisco called The Good Times, which had a history of radical ideology. During this time, Gaikowski was known to smoke pot regularly and use heavier drugs such as speed and LSD. And there are 2 immediate responses that I have to this. The first is, the Zodiac Killer did write very clearly that he had good times in Vallejo, although it was definitely before 70s, although it does say here 1969, 70, and 71. This is mentioned in 1969 when the Zodiac Killer is saying that he's having good times in Vallejo. As early as January of 1969, the Good Times newspaper was running violent works of fiction that were nearly a blueprint for the Zodiac's future crimes. Wednesday was a production day for the weekly Good Times newspaper, with the staffers working from early in the morning until very late at night to prepare for the new issue. Between Zodiac's debut in 1969, in July of 1969, until the Good Times folded in 1973, the Zodiac mailed 15 letters. Never did he mail a letter on a Wednesday, although he did on every other day of the week. And this is the stuff that I think got people a little bit fired up. It was perhaps the only episode of Black Box Online Radio that I did back in 2017 that actually got some type of friction going and the sparks flying when I said, I don't want to hear about what someone didn't do. I don't want to hear that, there was no letter mailed on a Wednesday, therefore it has to be the editor of a newspaper. Maybe you would say there were no letters mailed on a Sunday morning, therefore it must have been a Catholic priest because he was at Mass. Or you could even say that no crimes took place on Monday night, therefore it was an announcer for Monday Night Football. And, I think you can get the idea. And more or less I do stand by that because that's looking at the lack of evidence as evidence. But I do get more thoughtful and curious about that, and I think that gets a lot of people thinking in a particular way. Now, moving onward here, on the very day that Zodiac debuted by mailing 3 rush-to-editor letters to 3 separate newspapers in the San Francisco area, with each letter containing 1/3 of a code, the Good Times, edited by Richard Gaikowski, just happened to run a cover that was split into thirds. It was the only instance of the Zodiac mailing a letter on a Thursday until after the Good Times folded in 1973. Okay, so this is another point where I was very critical in 2017 by saying that, no, is there some reason why the newspaper was folded into thirds as opposed to being folded in half? And what's changed since then is I found an article on ZodiacCiphers.com which said that the reason why it was folded into thirds was because there was a story that was done on 3 different people, and when you would open the newspaper, you could see each person on a third of the interior section of the newspaper. And I mean, is that just it? Is that just a coincidence? When I first read that years ago, that the newspaper was folded into thirds and the Zodiac is mailing these 3 parts of the cipher, chills just went down my spine, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so creepy. But another thing that I've dealt with in the true crime world over the last few years is just because something begins with a real creepy feeling and then finding 5 or 6 coincidences that may or may not be true, just because you experience that, it doesn't mean it's an answer to a murder mystery. That is not an effective way to solve a murder mystery, by like being curious about something that is bothering you emotionally and then adding on all of these coincidences, circumstantial evidence, and just things that may or may not be relevant, but it happens all the time. People will write books about this type of material, and it's not to say anything about this particular post on Richard Gaikowski from ZodiacKiller.com. That's about my own experience. That's about the way that I've tried to avoid functioning when I'm looking into a true crime case. I definitely did in the past, but I want to avoid doing that in the future. In articles he published in 1969, Gaikowski had the habit of shortening his last name to 4 letters and used multiple spellings such as Geik, or interestingly, Geik interestingly, Gyke, Gyke, can be clearly seen in the Zodiac's 3-part cipher. At the very time the Zodiac wrote his only letter to the Vallejo Times-Herald, Gaikowski's best friend Bob worked at that very newspaper. And that is one thing about Gaikowski. You do often hear about him interacting with people in social circles, but you often do not exactly hear about him having the best amount of strong relationships. And in fact, Richard Gaikowski was somebody who truly wrestled with his homosexuality. And I shouldn't have even said that. He wrestled with his sexuality. And Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com has wanted to make one thing very clear to people like me who have been very critical of Geik as a suspect by saying that Geik was gay. He was a homosexual, and I don't think the Zodiac Killer was a homosexual. Tom Voigt's response was that Richard Gaikowski was dealing with his identity in somewhat of a method of denial. He was looking at his sexuality as something he wanted to either repress, suppress, or deny, and he wasn't completely sure that he was gay. He hadn't chosen to live life as a gay man, and in fact, he was trying to deny that part of his life. And women would also, multiple women reported him for either some type of sexual harassment or misconduct. Maybe misconduct is a better word than harassment. I want to be careful with my words. And the whole point is, it seems like when the Zodiac crimes took place, Geik was trying to live the life of a heterosexual male, and this does happen from time to time. I mean, I think we've all heard stories about that where someone is living their life and they get married and they have children, and then 10 years later they just decide that they want to take on the life of a homosexual. And I'm not saying Geik's exactly like that, but these things do happen. On March 13th of 1971, the Zodiac sent a letter to the Los Angeles Times, coinciding closely with the mailing. Gaikowski was involuntarily committed to the Napa State Hospital after going berserk. He was then diagnosed with a mental illness and began treatment at Mount Zion Hospital. The Zodiac didn't write again for almost 3 years. When the Zodiac reemerged in 1974 with letters referencing recent movie releases, Gaikowski was operating a storefront theater in the Mission District of San Francisco. A film buff, Gaikowski eventually became involved with San Francisco's Roxy Theater. And this is a part of the post that I talked about very critically in 2017, but I had somewhat of a reversal. I was being very dismissive of that, and I just said, I don't care. What is everyone who watched a movie in 1974 also a suspect? I mean, just because the Zodiac's referencing contemporary film, big deal, so what? Well, it's a little bit more than just referencing contemporary film. For starters, the Zodiac wrote the Exorcist letter in 1974. Maybe that's more famous. And then there is the Count Marco letter, which also contains a reference to the Red Phantom, which may or may not have been referring to a character from a movie. Then the Zodiac references the movie Badlands in the Badlands card. So that firstly, it's possible that some of those letters that I cited were not authentic correspondences, but it's also possible that the Zodiac is reinventing himself as some type of twisted and demented film buff. The evidence for this is that in the 1974 Exorcist letter, the Zodiac begins by saying, I saw and think that The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy ever, and then even in the Badlands card, some critical things are said about that particular movie. And there's also the Holden Zodiac activity, which has been explained. But I still have to lean toward the elephant in the room that lots of people would have been exposed to contemporary film, and there could have been another reason why someone chose to use those specific references. But I think that we're going to have to more or less leave Gaikowski right there. I mean, I apologize for any type of misinformation or info that I stated in the past about him that may have been false, but I also want to circle back to a statement that I said I would respond to, and that is, as it says very clearly in this post, Gaikowski was someone who would regularly use marijuana, as well as harder drugs like speed and LSD. And in short, Geik is a schizophrenic and a heavy drug user. Now, I'm just not convinced the Zodiac Killer was a heavy drug user, and I'm also not convinced that the Zodiac was a schizophrenic, because when you read the Zodiac Killer's letters, it appears to be someone who is in control of what he's doing, and a schizophrenic plus a drug user is out of control. And even if it's possible that Geik was a very high-functioning schizophrenic, or the Zodiac Killer was a very high-functioning schizophrenic, the drug use part, I also think would have been much easier to hide up and would have definitely affected this person's impulsivity in a different way. And I'm just not convinced that the Zodiac Killer regularly did speed or LSD, but I would like to move on a bit, and before we do, once again, please respond to any of the comments I made about Richard Gaikowski as a Zodiac suspect, and I also want to be very clear, in the last 5 years, I've added some new things to what I thought about before. I've admitted that I was somewhat wrong about things, but I've also stand by some of the claims that I made. Please feel free to respond. I noticed that a lot of you guys were leaving comments about a particular aspect of serial killers, and this is not related to Gaikowski, but with a different topic, and that is that they're looking at how the serial killer is driven by some type of outside force or inside force to kill, and it's almost blaming someone else or something else for the crimes that they are committing. So I would even like to go to this post that was shared on Facebook by Tina L., a regular listener to this show, who says, interesting true fact, Danny Rowland, the Gainesville Ripper, was partially inspired by the movie The Exorcist Part 3, whereas the Zodiac Killer mentions the Exorcist original movie in one of his taunting letters. I believe this points to how most killers claim to be good, but a demon takes control of them when they commit their horrid acts. The movie Scream was loosely based on the crimes of Danny Rowling, and a lot of people have left some similar comments here on YouTube. Some of them have been about the Zodiac Killer suspect, Dennis Rader. That's right, BTK. BTK is also a Zodiac suspect, but he is not very widely discussed. And I also want to tie this back into an episode that I did for the Anything Goes Friday segment when I was talking about Christian Bala and the murder of Dariusz Januszewski from Poland. And that story was turned into a movie called Dark Crimes, which features Jim Carrey in a crime drama, if you will. It's also like a thriller and a psychological movie. But there's this fictional character that's based on the real-life murderer Christian Bala. His name is Christoph Kozlov in the movie, and he says, at first someone creates this imaginary persona, and then they try to make that persona responsible for the crimes that have taken place. And I think a very clear example of this in fiction is the show Dexter, as well as the books that were written by Jeff Lindsay. Absolutely amazing stories. I mean, I don't have favorites or anything. Like, I don't have a favorite writer or anything, but when I was in my early 20s, I absolutely loved the Dexter novels by Jeff Lindsay because they had this, like, black humorous element to it, a lot of very dark comedy in it, and it's the story of a serial killer, but I was really impressed about how he was able to create entertainment in some unexpected ways. But the serial killer Dexter has this thing called the Dark Passenger, who is almost just like the imaginary persona that Kozlov was talking about. And BTK is a real life example of someone who had what he called a monster in his brain, and this was called Factor X. And I would like to read something about that because some people think that the Zodiac Killer was operating this way. This is from AETV.com. What is Factor X that BTK blamed for his urge to kill by Kate Sullivan, just citing the source. Serial killer Dennis Rader wants to control his narrative. That was clear when the devout Lutheran dad and Boy Scout troop leader told police to call him by a self-given nickname, BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them, also referred to as bind, torture, kill. He coined another term, Factor X, which he blamed or credited for his drive to commit 10 murders between 1974 and 1991. And I don't know about you, but just reading that introductory paragraph there, it seems like this is kind of in line with what Kozlov was talking about, that it's about blamelessness. It's about putting oneself into the category of blamelessness, where he's not responsible for the crimes, Factor X is. And with the Zodiac Killer, we don't know what his Dark Passenger would have been called. Some of you guys in the comment section were even saying the Zodiac's whole persona would be the Factor X. Not those exact words, but the demon that's driving him to kill. The Zodiac's entire message is driven by this demon. When corresponding with forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland, Rader was interested in having her uncover the source of Factor X, which she said was a mystery to him. Was it demonic or something else? Her assessment was less otherworldly. She said Rader had a trajectory toward violence, opportunities to kill, combined with unusual sexual proclivities, and a desire for fame. And I think if you watch BTK's confession here on YouTube, you will see that all of those are true, particularly the desire for fame. I also did a full response to the confession here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. When criminologist Dr. Scott Bond interviewed Rader for his book, Why We Love Serial Killers, The Curious Appeal of the World's Most Savage Murderers, he tapped into Rader's narcissism. I sort of played Clarice Starling, soliciting his expertise, Bond says. Raider jumped at the chance to correspond. A psychopath thinks they're the most interesting person in the world, Bond says. Now, I do have one particular response to that statement, and that's the title of the book, actually, Why We Love Serial Killers. I talk about serial killers every single week here on Black Box Online Radio, and the regular listeners to this program are listening to stories about serial killers every single week. I mean, the Zodiac Killer, for example. But I do not love them. These were terrible people. And it's not only the serial killers, the murderers, or when I did the story on Anthony Miela, the M25 rapist, criminals of that nature. They are terrible people. And sometimes we are exploring stories that involve people whom we do not like, whom we do not appreciate, and whom we recognize were very bad, sinister, and devious individuals. So I just want to be clear. I don't love serial killers in that particular sense. I love all of humanity, and I guess that includes them. But individually, do I love Dennis Rader? No. And do I think that he was a good person? No. What about some of these other people like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber? No. Not all serial killers are psychopaths, and not all psychopaths are serial killers. Some are successful CEOs or renowned surgeons. And I think that there are lots of psychopathic traits in both CEOs and surgeons, so no disagreement there. Unencumbered by human emotions and able to hide in plain sight, they tend to be the most prolific and effective serial killers. This was especially true in the 1970s when chronal profiling was new and technology was unsophisticated. The 1970s were the me decade, and it was the me decade of serial killers too, says Bond. Serial killers like BTK and the Son of Sam emerged to make a statement to the police and the press. You will take me seriously. Rader was ultimately caught because of his ego and advances in technology. In 2004, he boastfully communicated with police via floppy disk, which they traced back to him. When asked about his correspondence with Rader's Factor X, what makes Raider want to be seen as more of a terrorist than a garden variety serial killer? Raider blames his urge to kill on something he calls Factor X. What do you think Factor X is, if it's anything at all? And what is he attempting to do there is neutralize his actions, deflect all guilt, as if to say, I'm no more responsible for killing than a venomous snake is. How can you blame me? And I think that's a very similar statement to what I said about blamelessness. It's talking about how he is not responsible for these crimes. Factor X is. Even if it's illegal, Factor X should be the one to take the fall, and he is a good person in just doing what he believes is fair and honest, and anything that he truly knows is illegal, wrong, or I dare say it's sinful, is the result of being controlled by Factor X. There's definitely a contradiction and hypocrisy there. One part says I have no control over it, and yet he absolutely craves killing and loves it. He told the authorities to refer to himself as BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill, his own brand name. And I think that paragraph's a little oddly worded as far as hypocrisy goes. I mean, wouldn't he also just say that Factor X drove him to call himself BTK? So I'm not exactly convinced of that, but I mean, that's just kind of looking at all possibilities. I do think that this paragraph is more or less telling the truth, that he craved killing and loved it, and that he had his own brand because he wanted people to know that he was killing people. So, halfway in, halfway out. That's me anyway. Do you think Raider is more of an egomaniac than other serial killers? I believe he became friends with the late Roy Hazelwood, one of the three FBI agents, who essentially created, profiling and interviewed many serial killers. What Hazelwood said about BTK is that he is profound, malignant, narcissistic, and sociopathic. He said Rader was one of the worst cases he's ever come across. And I do think that Dennis Rader was a sociopath or a psychopath. Psychopath meaning that he was born with it, and sociopath meaning that society or his social surroundings altered the course of his brain chemistry. Were you corresponding by anything were you surprised by anything in your correspondence with Rader? I totally butchered that. One thing was odd. He created this alternate reality for himself. Behind bars, he's investing in stocks and real estate. He's a wealthy investor in his mind and keeps copious records of his investment. And that I don't think is too odd from the Zodiac killer. The Zodiac seemed to have a powerful imagination, and it seems like Dennis Rader had a powerful imagination, and that goes right back to Ray Bradbury's statements about serial killers in Farewell Summer, the novel that he wrote, when he just simply talks about how a serial killer is a child in a man's body or an adult body without love, and they're also just being forced to live lives in a certain way, but also that imagination and mental energy are most likely off the charts for serial killers, and a lot of them are probably very good at getting lost in their imagination. I said openly about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, that I thought that he became very destructive toward his neighbors in Montana because the only time that he could be at peace was when he was concentrating, and that his neighbors in Montana made too much noise, so he had to go after them. And all I'm really seeing about BTK is that he's bored in prison. He doesn't have anybody in his life, so he is going to try and develop this imaginary game. But, it's like he's just someone living in the world of emotions and imagination, imaginary game, as well as not following the laws of society. And let's not downplay this part here about how there is an alternate reality that has been created for oneself. Some people think that a schizophrenic cannot do that. They can't differentiate between the alternative realities in their mind and real life and the external world. But I also think that Zodiac Killer was probably very similar to someone who would have had Factor X, the monster that lives in his brain and is taking over. And I definitely think the Zodiac would have put himself into the category of blamelessness because the Zodiac was such a coward and a weakling and just writes all these letters. I'm losing in control. There's this thing inside me that's driving me to kill. And the Zodiac is also. But when it comes to a discussion about the Zodiac Killer and BTK, almost certainly it has to only be about similarities and differences. There is almost zero chance that the Zodiac and BTK were the same person. BTK was stationed in Japan in the military. He was actually in the Air Force from 1968 all the way to 1970, or definitely the entirety of Zodiac activity. He's out of the country, so he almost certainly did not commit these crimes. Now, to move on to a different question, actually, this one comes to us from Scott Young, who says, Hi, thank you for all of the great Zodiac content. I really appreciate all of it. I'm sorry if I should be asking this in one of your AMAs. I don't listen to podcasts unless they end up as YouTube videos, so I'm not sure where to submit an AMA question. Anyway, my question should hopefully be pretty simple for you to answer. After being kidnapped, Kathleen Johns reportedly saw a Zodiac sketch on a wanted poster and said that that was the kidnapper. Do you know which sketch she identified? I've always assumed it was the one that has a signature in the bottom right corner with a date that appears to say 10/13/69 with case 696314 Armstrong and Tosky written underneath it. Because I think that was the one that was most likely on wanted posters. But I also know that there is the Lake Berryessa sketch, which could have been on posters too. Thank you. Now, as I understand the story, Kathleen Johns was driving her car on March 22nd of 1970 down Highway Route 132 in California. And this is the time when some guy is saying, your back wheel is wobbling, and he was telling her to pull over and said he was going to help her tighten the bolts, but he was actually loosening them. So when she tried to drive away, he said, oh, looks like it's worse than I thought, and that she was briefly abducted by the Zodiac killer, and that and then they drove around for some time, and she was able to escape. And then when she got to the police station, she saw the poster of the Zodiac and said, that's the man who abducted me. And then the Zodiac killer would go on to take credit for this crime in a letter saying that he gave a ride to a woman and her baby. And Kathleen Johns not only had a child with her, but she also was pregnant at the time. So, to be very honest, I don't know about the exact same thing that she saw. I would expect that it would be the two versions of the Zodiac's composite sketch that were done after the murder of Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969, the sketches that were based on information shared by the Robbins kids who saw the Zodiac leaving the scene of the Stine murder, the Zodiac's final crime, because on most commonly found wanted posters involving the Zodiac killer, you see the first sketch and then the amended version. So I think that they would have had those two images. Did it have the Lake Berryessa voyeur with the dark hair and the more rectangular face? I think that there's a low chance that that was the one that was witnessed, but what is more interesting is that Kathleen Johns would then go on to say that Zodiac killer suspect Lawrence Kane was the man who attacked her, and I think Lawrence Kane looks very little like the composite sketch that it was done after the Stein shooting. He has a more rectangular face like Richard Gaikowski, and he doesn't have that pointed chin. He also doesn't appear to have had the exact same hairline. But anything is possible, and I will always accept the end result once it is shared. But anyway, I would like to now go on to your shout-outs from BuyMeACoffee.com and the super thanks here on YouTube. Anyone who makes a donation or contribution to help support the show will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And the first one comes to us from Batman66. Thank you for your continued support, Batman, who says, super thanks, and I definitely appreciate that. And our next supporter shout out goes to Floyd Black 53 from BuyMeACoffee.com, who says, I hope 2023 is a great year for you, Ned. I love your content. It never fails to get me pondering into the wee hours. Thanks to you guys, and as far as some new developments go on the channel, I'm still doing the ongoing series about the Phantom Killer, which comes out every Wednesday, and I started a book discussion about called Guilty, the story of JonBenet Ramsey, available here on the weekends, and the book discussion is on the book Presumed Guilty by Stephen Singular. My title is just Guilty, and I'm going to be doing something that's not exactly a New Year's resolution, but more or less, it's just an ambition that I have. I want to keep up with that weekly segment about JonBenet Ramsey because I'm very curious about her story, the murder of this child back in 1996, but also I've wanted to do this for quite some time, and that is to read the book The Death of Innocence, which was written by JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey. And I think some of you guys might not be too excited about that because you're going to be thinking, oh, well, they're just going to be liars and they're just going to say things that aren't true. I want to find out. I mean, my copy is on the way. Amazon.com is going to drop it off in a couple of days. So that's something that I'm definitely looking forward to. And there are other books that I have in order that I want to read about JonBenet and respond to them and share them with you guys here. And I did 2 episodes recently about Jack the Ripper, and I don't mean to turn the Anything Goes Friday segment into the Jack the Ripper Friday segment, but I'm just going down the rabbit hole, like further down, and I'm getting more and more consumed by that mystery as well, the same way that I have been by the Zodiac. And I am also someone who has taken the very bold stance that the answers to the Zodiac Killer mystery will be found in the Ripper case. I truly think that. There's just so many similarities. And another book that I'm looking forward to reading in its entirety is the one by Zed Simpson about Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac. So I think that that is a book that has received a lot of criticisms, and it's done by the Charles River Editors series, and they received some very negative reviews online. But I don't mind. If there's something wrong, well, I'll share that and I'll make it known, and I will just say what I genuinely think about it. But if you just look at the similarities between Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac, both of them were serial killers that wrote letters. Jack the Ripper wrote his first letter after the second murder. The Zodiac wrote his first victim after this. He wrote his first letter after the second crime. Excuse me. The Zodiac cut off a piece of Paul Stein's shirt on the backside and mailed it in with a letter. Jack the Ripper cut out a victim's kidney and mailed it in with a letter, and those both happened after the fourth crime took place, although there would be a different number of victims because the Zodiac would target couples who were in cars, and Jack the Ripper targeted prostitutes. So there are similarities and differences, but I look forward to this book on Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac by Zed Simpson, and I'll share some things briefly about it. I don't think I would do a single episode on that theory. And the final thing that I would like to share with you is another regret that I had for the year 2022. And I have to give a shout out to Barry Lauber, who wrote out a brilliant comment about how I was being too dismissive of conspiracy theories because sometimes conspiracies are true, and sometimes the conspiracy theorists are telling the truth. And I really neglected a lot of the ideas that I had back in 2017 because I used to talk about that stuff all the time about how, yes, there are true conspiracy theories. Sometimes people are hiding the truth, usually for malicious reasons. And I was reminded of a particular set of books that had been written by Daniel Pipes back in, let's see, must have been the late 90s, even mid to late 90s when he wrote them. He had 2 books out about conspiracies. One of them was called The Hidden Hand, which was about the conspiracy theories of the Middle East. And he had another book simply called Conspiracy, which was about the theories of European origin, more or less. And that's the one that would talk about the Illuminati, as well as the Bilderberg Group and the Council on Foreign Relations, which, of course, is more American even, but I mean, America has lots of roots and connections to Europe and the Western world, perhaps, versus the Middle East. So I was reminded of some people that were put on the list by Daniel Pipes and that were called conspiracy theorists. These people received the title of conspiracy theorist. Noam Chomsky, Christopher Hitchens, Lyndon LaRouche, Seymour Hersh, and they were people who were journalists and commentators and linguists like Noam Chomsky. Okay, a linguist and political theorist. But Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent is all about people hiding the truth, usually for a malicious reason, or just how the media and the politicians and big corporations are all on the same side, and they're creating this image of choice and this illusion of choice and this distraction of the media like itself is distracting people from actually making an honest choice and achieving fairness, and instead they're just deceiving people. And a prime example of this is people learn about politicians from what they see in the media, whether it's the internet or television, which was discussed at the time that the book was written. So if the media just presents the material in a certain way, then people are going to start to think in a certain way. If they create a scandal, they can destroy a politician, or if they say good things about him, they can improve the reputation of a politician, manufacturing consent. And some of the people like Seymour Hersh, for example, an investigative journalist who revealed loads of stories, but through investigations, learning that people were indeed hiding the truth, like the stories of the My Lai massacre or Abu Ghraib prison. And there's a fascinating book out there about Seymour Hersh called Scoop Artist by Robert Maraldi, and I think that book is so good because it shows how someone would investigate and how someone would be trying to learn, well, just that, how are people hiding the truth, usually for a malicious reason? And that's just something that I wanted to share with you guys. The point is, conspiracy theorists aren't always wrong, and sometimes they aren't even conspiracy theorists, they're just independent investigators. Well, that's all from me now. Thank you so much for everyone who has listened to this episode. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.